Okay, so if I might now have your attention for the main portion of the program. Before we get to the keynote for this evening, I did want to sort of set to rest some very important points about your presence here. One is that no, the barrels here are not full, they're empty. Second, no, CG staff did not drain them. Third, yes, there are tunnels going out of this building because it is a former distillery. And fourth, that's because, as you might imagine, when you have a government intervention like prohibition that is not backed up by sound regulation and institutions, the laws of economics do take over. So that's, in brief, the story of this building. Moving on then, I again wanted to welcome all of you to Waterloo and to CG and to this INET-CG conference on false dichotomies, and to say how privileged we are to have in our midst Emma Rothschild to speak to us this evening. There is a biography of her in the program. In many ways she needs no introduction, and rather than repeat it, in terms of the ethos and the objective of this subject that we're treating, let me just say this. Professor Rothschild is the Jeremy and Jane Knowles Professor of History and Director of the Joint Center for History and Economics at Harvard University, Magdalen College, and King's College, Cambridge. In keeping with our objectives, she has really spent her career working at the intersection of economics, history, and philosophy. She has been a member of the, and one of the things that came up in the plenary previously was, can you think of people who've been sound academics and then worked in the policy dimension as well? Emma Rothschild has been the member of the Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution in the UK and a member of the Council on Science and Technology in the UK. She's a former chair of the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development and is on the board of the United Nations Foundation as well. Her current project with INET is a project that's very much about having economists learn how best to use the tools of history and have historians learn best how to exploit the methodologies and the tools that economics has to offer. And her talk today is going to be on another one of those dichotomies that dogs us, which is states and markets. So welcome, Emma, and thank you.
Thanks very much. So it's great to be here. It's great to be among INET friends. And I knew INET when it was so big. And look at it now. I'd like to start with some recent history, now perhaps almost forgotten. All elections are historic, or at least all national or presidential elections. It's only in retrospect that some come to seem unmomentous. But the US election of 2012 was historic or historical in the very particular sense that the disputes, and there were many, turned to an unusual extent on US economic history, on the history of economic thought, and on the history of economic policy. There was the inheritance of Abraham Lincoln and Theodore Roosevelt, the interpretation of Adam Smith, and even the more recent inheritance of Milton Friedman. All thought is thinking with history. How can one think with the future? But in 2012, the historical has been everywhere. Well, this is a depiction of Governor Romney's major address on economic principles at the University of Chicago. You'll note Milton towards the top, as in Friedman, rather than as in the free enterprise liberalism of Paradise Lost. This is President Obama's major address in Kansas, also on economic principles. And this, before the candidate for whom I guess some 59 million Americans voted only a few days ago is entirely forgotten, is what it was all about. And this is where my embedded video should come in. It's very short. Oh no, the other one, the top one. Sorry. What is this? No, the other link, sorry. Why did I put, doesn't matter. What a shame. I think we better, it's the one when he describes what the election is about, and it's about the future of the free enterprise system. Let's go back to, okay. What? It's all right, it's all right. So what do these large disputes over the nature of the system mean? The two large economic ideas, the economic dichotomies on which so much of the election turned, were government and the market, or the state and free enterprise. And the election also turned, even more momentously, on the nature of the system. One of the achievements of the economic policies of 2008 to 9, in the retrospect of their principal figures, the bipartisan policies of President Bush at the end of his term and of President-elect Obama, was to have saved the system. This was the language of then Secretary of the Treasury Paulson, that the policy saved the financial system through the bank bailout, the industrial system through the auto bailout, and the economic or free enterprise system by averting a catastrophic crisis. Well, the election results suggest that this retrospective argument was, by a narrow margin, convincing. But is it really the case that there are historic changes underway in the character of the economic system, or in the relationship between the market and the state? Well, the most straightforward economic statistics present a puzzle. This is overall government expenditure and federal government expenditure as a share of gross domestic product in the United States over the period from 1970 to 2011. A very undramatic picture. And these are personal income and personal taxes over the same period. A dramatic picture in this case, but one that is very different from the picture of an ever-encroaching state, in that personal taxes have declined very substantially as a share of personal income, just as government expenditure has been more or less stable as a percentage of GDP. So how are these pictures to be reconciled? One possibility is that something historic may have been happening, that the impact or importance of government has increased more than its size, that the effectiveness, or perhaps the insidiousness of government has increased over time. A possible explanation may have to do with the size of the national debt, and perhaps of overall public and private indebtedness. This is a depiction of public debt from the campaign. Another explanation is psychological. It is that government, when it reaches a certain share of GDP, or in the case of the contemporary US, a share weighted for increased insidiousness, begins to influence the social and even the moral foundations of free enterprise. Friedrich Hayek, writing at the end of the Second World War, described a great historic arc of economic ideas and economic policies, from Pericles to Bismarck's social insurance policies to the British Labour government of the 1930s, the road to serfdom. This is an historical argument, and it's an argument which should, I believe, be addressed seriously by historians, or rather, perhaps, by historians and economists and sociologists and psychologists together. For the state or government, in its economic activities and consequences, is one of the great unexplored frontiers of historical inquiry. So is the history of the market. There are two really vast questions for government over the coming generation and beyond the disputes of the election season. One has to do with global climate change and the costs of energy use. The other has to do with transfer payments, including for social security and health insurance, which explain essentially the entirety of the increase in the role of government over the medium term. Well, these questions are, for many different reasons, extraordinarily difficult. Climate change, in part, because it involves transnational governance and costs that traverse or make a mockery of the boundaries of nation states. And transfer payments because they involve social relationships, aging, illness, and insecurity, which traverse the boundaries between the economic and the private, or the private life of the family. The argument made by President Obama during the campaign for what he calls smart government, or for what is elsewhere described as public-private partnership, is an indication, or so it seems, that these large and difficult questions will continue to be seen as ones to be addressed by the market and the state. But this will mean either a continuing increase in the size of government, or an increase in government regulation, and perhaps also in government insidiousness or effectiveness, or both. It also imposes, or should impose, a difficult and historical examination of the very constitution of the difficult questions themselves, or of the dichotomy or dichotomies of market and state, economy and government. Times of economic crisis are almost always times of increased demand for historical inquiry, a cyclical boom in the market for economic history and for the history of economic thought. The foundations of these two subdisciplines, which have a tendency over time to diverge and merge and again diverge, were indeed constructed in the course of the crises of the 1890s and the 1930s. Economic history is relevant, or so it seems, when economic difficulties assume epochal or historical proportions. And the history of economic thought is of relevance when economic theories are in a state of, let us say, fluidity. So I'd like to talk about three different historical narratives, all of which call into question the dichotomy of the market, or the economy, and the state, or government. The first is about the history of the state itself, an empirical inquiry, that is to say, into what states do and who it is that does these things that they do. There is a fairly familiar story that corresponds, more or less, to the history of what is called, anachronistically, economic policy. In a first stage, that is to say, the state is feudal, ancient, something to be dismantled. Adam Smith's late 18th century state, more or less. In a second stage, to which Adam Smith's immediate successors looked forward, the state, conceived as a peacetime and non-colonial state, declined to a stable and minimal level. This is Jean-Baptiste Say in 1803. Government amounted to half the expenditure of the not 1803, 1816, but better times were to come. A government, even in the great powers, could be organized in such a manner as to consume no more than 1% of the general revenues of the country. This is the late Victorian or night watchman state of Gladstone and Disraeli. But by the later Victorian period, British economists at least believed that their statesmen and public officials were so upstanding and they themselves were so enlightened that they could afford to imagine a new, good economic state. This stage 3 state had different roles according to different economic tendencies: to ensure some minimum of social security, or to create markets and the condition for their efficient functioning, or to invest in the physical infrastructure of economic growth. Then, in a fourth stage, at least for many mid-20th century economists, the activities of government began to grow in an uncontrolled way. This was the usurping state, the approach to Armageddon. And it is in this stage 4 in the heavily stylized history of economic thought about the state that the origins of the long present crisis are to be found. For the economic theories of Hayek and of other critics of the usurping state were of profound importance for political and economic life in Eastern Europe, in Asia, and in the Anglo-American world of what used to be called the Washington Consensus. Let me take you back in recent history to the euphoric spring of 1981. This is President Reagan, fairly soon after his inauguration. When Prime Minister Thatcher was here recently, we both remarked on the sudden overwhelming changes that had come recently to politics in both our countries. At our last official function, I told the Prime Minister that everywhere we look in the world, the cult of the state is dying. We are surrounded still by the debates of that time, and there is a great deal of late 19th century economic thought, mostly Austrian, in the economic ideology of the Romney-Ryan program, just as there is, I have to say, a great deal of the Marshallian, Pigovian, following Alfred Marshall and A.C. Pigou, sense of utter confidence as to the enlightenment of economists and the virtue of public officials in the so-called smart government of the Obama-Biden program, under which we will continue to live. But the history of the state, or of really existing states, is very different from these stylized facts, to use the expression of the late, great Nicholas Caldor. It is also strikingly little studied, for which my own profession, namely historians, not economic historians or economists, but historians, are, I fear, to blame. There has been a great deal of history of the state from above, of course, of founding fathers and generals and prime ministers. There is much military history. There is excellent recent history on states in their overseas and imperial roles, on the officials of the British, French, and Spanish empires, for example, and on the administration of the slave trade. But there has been very surprisingly little history, at least in the past 20 or 30 years, a period during which the history of the economy has been relatively unfavored in history departments, of how the economic activities have changed over time, of who it is who works for the state or for international, national, and local governments, and of how the revenue sources of the state have changed and are determined. So my second stylized narrative has to do with the theory and measurement of the state. The depiction of the state that is implicit in the dichotomy talk of recent months is of a natural organization or organism, the market or the economy, in which an outside or exogenous force, the state or government, interferes or intervenes. But this view poses evident difficulties in the sort of world that Jean-Baptiste Say described in 1816, or that Hayek feared in 1944, or that is so much discussed today. A world, that is to say, in which government accounts, in some sense, for approximately half of the economy. Psychological difficulties, one might think, if half of oneself is not oneself, alienation or something like that. Now, the details and the history of how government is measured and depicted in the national income and product accounts are very arcane indeed. And it's tremendously great that Joe Stiglitz chaired a really serious commission that looked at national income accounts, at the very deep issues that they raise, and at ways to make them better. I think it is all the same important to recall the astonishing innocence of the formal definitions of government activity that were put forward in the founding period of standardized national income and product accounts in the wartime or immediately post-war world of the 1940s and early 1950s. The first quotation is from the first is from the US Department of Commerce, sort of the locus classicus of national income accounting. The state was a simple extension of individual households which undertakes agency activities for the body of consumers as a whole. For Richard Stone, the founder on the British side, it provides output on behalf of the community as a whole, which it has been found better to secure collectively rather than individually. And there's something for a Brit unbelievably Pigovian or Marshallian about the verb structure there. It has been found better to secure. There are redoubtable difficulties in measuring the output of government, which are also, I believe, conceptual difficulties connected in turn to the ontology of the state as inside or outside the economy. One difficulty is that the expenditure, which has increased so much in recent decades and which is at the center of the frightening predictions about future doom, expenditure on transfer payments to persons, or in the arithmetic of the US election campaign to the 47%, is not accounted for in income and product accounts because it is not part of production or of income from work or assets. The slide I showed earlier is a trick, well, it's not really a trick in that sense. The increase in government is so minimal in NIPA accounts because so much government expenditure doesn't count. There are other, less familiar difficulties, and I will simply mention them here, although the first will be of central importance. And I won't dwell on them here, but I do want to say that these will be, the first at least, will be of central importance to tax reform in the US, and the third possibly of even more momentous importance. Tax expenditures, as people here know, include the costs of deductions, all the things that successive governments and Congresses since the Carter administration have wanted to do or to reward and have not wanted to pay for with taxes. On the second line, the policies of the government in the financial crisis of 2008-2009 took the form, in substantial part, of what were called capital transfer payments to businesses and the subsidy costs of loan guarantees. And these are extremely difficult to accommodate in national income and product accounts. Federal credit guarantees and the very large stock of contingent liabilities with which they are associated are, in turn, likely to be of daunting importance to the future of public finance in the United States. Another illustration of the things that successive governments and Congresses, in this case going back to the administration of Warren Harding, have wanted to do or to reward and have not wanted to pay for with taxes. So my third and last historical narrative has to do with the history of economic thought. Let me return to Adam Smith here since he has been so much in the news these days. As Mitt Romney said in the speech I showed you in the word cloud earlier, I quote, "When the heavy hand of government replaces the invisible hand of the market, economic freedom is the inevitable victim." As he said a few months later in another economic speech, America is on the cusp of having a government-run economy. Adam Smith is rightly identified as a sharp critic of what I described as the bad stage one state, the sort of feudal state. But what he was not, in any sense, was a theorist of the 20th and 21st century dichotomy of the market and the state. There was indeed a widespread and, in retrospect, salutary uncertainty in Smith's time as to what the state or government was and how it should be described. This is a remark made by one of Smith's close friends in the House of Commons in 1773. This was a debate about the East India Company. What is the state? And what if you say the company is the state? People talked like this in the House of Commons in the 1770s. It was a good period for oratory. And I think more generally in Smith's lifetime, and indeed in his particular larger circle of friends, there was astonishingly deep discussion about the theory and nature of the state. These are the Johnstons, the Scottish family of semi-economists who I wrote about in a book called The Inner Life of Empires. And they were continually talking about and writing to each other about the nature of government and the nature of economic life, issues that we would think of as ontological or deeply conceptual, which for them was part of ordinary daily discussion over tea, as it were. One very important insight of Smith's, which is largely ignored in modern depictions of his theory, is that the state that he so disliked was overwhelmingly a military and religious state more than an economic state. And it was a state, like government today in many respects, that was operated by and for the rich and powerful. So the kind of aseptic view of Smith that has been so often put forward in the last 100 years or so, taking his theoretical insights out of the historical context in which he himself put them and literally leaving out his long paragraphs describing what it was he so much disliked in the state, has had the effect of making his, on the one hand, making his theories apparently much more widely applicable to the economic activities of a very different state, and on the other hand has obscured what seemed to be so revolutionary and frightening about his rhetoric in the period immediately following his death, which was the period of the French Revolution, namely that he was bitterly criticizing the state and saying that it was engaged in military adventures, it was deeply involved with oppressive religious authorities, and it was a state that operated to the benefit of the rich and powerful, including the people who put pressure on members of the House of Commons. I do think that there are really interesting questions for economists, as well as for historians, to be explored in these more or less ontological choices, and questions even that are very close to the most important concerns of modern economic theory. For the key historical questions in relation to the economic state are about information, they're about property rights, and they're about the traverse from one to another property rights regime, and about economic behavior. Just in relation to property rights, economic historians tend to see a large traverse from different kinds of physical manifestations in which property is held, from land to machines in the Industrial Revolution to intellectual or human capital. But if one thinks about the language in which even the fiscal cliff and certainly the medium-term question of government reform is being talked about in this country, actually the metaphors are those of ownership of land, entitlement to land. This is also present in other discussions of the political economy of government, namely rent-seeking. But I think it's possible to make an argument that if one thinks about the 47% and thinks about the form of property that people own, it is property that that is in the form of entitlements, an expectation as to a stream of future benefits. And this, of course, is a question that has a very close relation to restrictions on international mobility. But the middle classes don't own all that much land. I don't know how much intellectual or human capital people own as individuals, but people do own entitlements, as that metaphorical description suggests. So, the economics of information, the economics of property right regimes, and the economics of behavior. I'm a great admirer of the public choice theorist James Buchanan, not least because he actually wrote a paper called The Coase Theorem and the Theory of the State. It's surely time for the worldwide crowd of behavioral economists to return now to some of Buchanan's and opposing Buchanan's Pigou's assumptions about how people really do live in the market and the state, and particularly in the domain of human existence that is neither one nor the other, or both at the same time. And Buchanan, as people here know, conceived of individuals in their role as government officials as seeking to maximize the rent on entitlements which had been assigned to them. Pigou, after a great deal of traumatic reflection on the subject, particularly during the depths of World War I, ended up assuming that government officials really were like the young men he taught in Cambridge. And I think we don't have either a history or a theory of what economic behavior is like within the market and within the state, especially in the world in which we live, in which the state is very like a market, and the market, particularly the financial market, is very much like a state, at least in the sense that the anticipation of regulation and regulatory change is absolutely central to the way financial markets work. So I'd finish by saying that markets are, of course, everywhere, and they're not very much like the actually existing markets that we know and love. I suppose we should, and I mean this very seriously, try to be more like the 18th century Johnstons, in one very limited respect, that we should be talking a lot more than we have been for the last 30 or 40 years about the nature of government and the nature of economic life. Thank you very much. Of course.
Thank you for that discourse. We do have about 20 minutes for questions or reaction from the floor. I believe there are floating microphones, so if you identify yourself, we will recognize you. Yes, go ahead. Anyone? I can't see terribly well. Sorry. Yeah, Robert. Hang on, that's got to be.
Rob Johnson from INET. When I hear discussions about government,
About
government and about
Yes.
the possibilities in social design of government, I think there's another dimension that has to be integrated, which is at any time at which we're debating, there is a history of government performance that stands just behind us. And whether it's propaganda or whether it's actual experience, some of the reluctance to envision empowering government further at this time comes from disappointed experience, like in the aftermath of the financial bailout in the United States. People may desire the services, but they don't know that they can trust the government to deliver those services. I'm just curious how in this debate you see that question of trust in the repeated game of governance playing a role.
Well, I have a lot of sympathy for the libertarian critique of the state. The motto from the great poet Hölderlin that Hayek uses in The Road to Serfdom is the state is the coldest of cold monsters, is a very eloquent thought. I mean, I think one does have to think about Hayek writing that with Nazi Germany in his mind. And I do think that something like the sort of regulatory ideology of smart government, of which the great colleague of mine, Cass Sunstein, is very much associated with, has a perhaps too innocent a view of what it is that officials are doing. That being said, the sort of propaganda about how terrible government is a really overwhelming feature of American public life going back to the 1970s. And I think the ideal of better public service, which I think was implicit in, for example, the work in public economics that Joe Stiglitz and Tony Atkinson and others did for so many years, is one of the noblest ideals one can aspire to. And I think the reason I started with the election is that I think it's too. I'm sorry, this is it's after dinner. This is all much too serious, really. But I think it's too easy to assume that the dichotomy talk of this election is going to go away easily and just conclude that there's going to be somewhat better macroeconomic policy and more smart regulation. I think these questions about the role of the state have very deep roots in American public discourse, and B, they really are deep questions. So, I'm much more critical of historians in a way than I am of economists for not thinking about this, because take somebody like John Brewer, a British historian of tax systems in the 18th century. I mean, that was wonderful empirical work about what the British state actually did. That sort of work is not particularly being done. But by mentioning the economics of information, the economics of property right regimes, and behavioral economics, I wanted to just gesture towards the fact that these are issues that are rather important and rather, fashionable among economists too. In fact, there's, I think, this set of issues about the history and theory of the state and the legal basis of the state, because legal history is a huge part of what's needed here. I mean, it is potentially something really productive for conversation across scholarly disciplines of the sort that INET is trying to encourage and that is being practiced here at this institute.
Yes, John Smith in York University. Could markets exist without the state?
No, and I think what I called the stage 3 state, when economists were theorizing the need for a new enlightened state to re-emerge after the sort of high Victorian minimum, a lot of that had to do with providing the kind of institutional basis for markets to exist, and to talk about something that's extremely sort of popular now, creating markets where markets did not exist. And I think that's certainly something that in some aspects of environmental policy has been very successful. But I think one of the shortcomings of the public choice theorists' approach to these subjects, and as I said, I give them great credit for taking the theory of the state seriously, but one of the shortcomings has been to have a sort of very indistinct frontier between or underexplored frontier between the good or constitutional state that provides the necessary framework for the rule of law, the judicial state, and the bad economic state. I mean, James Buchanan, by the way, was very unusual among the so-called conservative economists of the 1970s, in that he did openly acknowledge that Adam Smith was seriously against military expenditure, and that a large part of what Smith was disliking so much was the military and belligerent 18th century state.
Giovanni Dosi from Pisa. What I find really striking, I think, in the current debate is that the zeitgeist in all political discourse is that market should rule unless otherwise proved. I mean, the zeitgeist everywhere, I mean, even in the center-left parties, all over advanced world. There is a sort of different degrees of market Talibanism in which you have got to prove that you have such a serious market failure, and not only, but to that would not correspond an even a more serious government failure, which is crazy. I mean, if you take economic theory seriously, the distance between any market and the market perfection that you find in an economic model is so high that I think Joe said long ago, if you take it seriously, the world is a huge market failure. Still, it is on the side of those that say we should do this, we should do that, we should have this policy, we should have this other policy, the burden of proof, which is totally crazy. And in fact, I mean, places this lot around this table, that is, I would consider us with different variation near center left, but very moderate, place us at the extreme left in the political debate. Now, the big question is, how did it come about? You, as an historian also of ideas, I mean, how did we get to this point in which the entire discourse in the US, but also in Europe, is in the Taliban hands, so to speak?
Well, I mean, that's what I meant in rather more after-dinnerish language by the 50 years of public discourse. But I think you're absolutely right to point to the extent to which this rhetoric, this language, has become a consensus not only in the United Kingdom and Germany, but in large parts of Western, well, certainly of Eastern, but also of Western Europe. And I think Albert Hirschman once talked about the, ironically, about the conception of the role of the state being to ferret out all instances of market failure and correct them. And this is I meant it about the psychological weirdness of thinking of the economy as being something which has the government outside it and interfering with it, when the government is a very large part of it. And I would think maybe for Professor Sunstein, there's a very, very small number of very, very enlightened regulators who do the ferreting out of market failures and getting incentives right work. I don't think they perhaps think enough about the whatever it's called in Kantian terms, the heteronomy of somebody else shaping people's wills through the architecture of choice, so that's the economic state, and then the state that quite a few people work for is another state, and the state that pays out some equivalent to 25% of GDP in transfer payments is yet another state. But think of the different metrics we've got about the effectiveness of government regulation, about the share of employment, about the share of national product, about the share of disposable income, personal income that comes from transfer payments. And I just think what's really important is to start a process of disaggregating our ideas of the state and maybe thinking we need different theories for different parts of what's going on. And this, of course, is very closely related to disaggregating the political state and the sort of work that Rob Johnson has been doing and talking about in relation to really understanding how congressional government or governance of economic activity works is the essential counterpart to that sort of empirical work on what the state really does. Because when I mentioned these three problems with accounting for the state, namely so-called tax expenditures, capital transfers to businesses, and federal credit guarantees with all the contingent liabilities that are out there and have been out there for a century. All of these have one thing in common, namely that they're ways of concealing the fact that Congress and the executive are doing things they want to do, either because they think they're right or because large and important groups want them. I think about deductions, without showing that they're doing them. And this goes back before the Reagan administration. I mean, it was certainly something that was well underway in the I think in the Carter administration, of just feeling the language and rhetoric of anti-tax, anti-state, anti-government is so overpowering that we can only do these things, which everyone agrees we should do, if we hide them. And it's piling up, I mean, much more than entitlement, quote-unquote, entitlement programs as such. This opacity about the economic impact of government really is piling up very, very major problems. And I don't want to say that one can have a head-on collision with 50 years of anti-state rhetoric, but I do think that by taking the theory as well as the history of government activities more seriously, one can begin to pull that apart. I mean, for people who are interested in how we got here, there's a fantastic new book about Hayek and the Mont Pelerin Society by Angus Bergin, a young historian of ideas. A very good book by Daniel Stedman Jones about the 1970s. So historians are beginning to address the mechanisms whereby this discourse became so entrenched. But that's not the same as changing it.
Thank you very much. Katharina Pistor from Columbia Law School. I'm wondering how your perspectives on the state might change if you throw in a little bit of comparative analysis and also the processes of globalization. So in my mind, the United States is still very much an outlier. And while it is true that also continental Europe has embraced more ideas of markets versus state, I think in general the population has still a much more positive view of the state. And that might be very much related to what you said, which is the ability of the state to deliver on entitlements or to grant entitlements, and that might create a different relationship between the individuals in society and the state. But it's nonetheless ironic that it is the countries of fascism and of former socialism that still have a probably more positive attitude towards the state today than the countries of liberalism like the United States or England. And let me just throw in globalization, because there have, of course, been all these ideas that now finally the state would wither away, not in the sense that Marx had envisaged it, but more in terms of the markets, the global markets take over. But when we look at the ways in which the states have constructed these global markets, a very different perspective emerges. So I've two sort of factual or maybe interpretative questions, and then the final one is about your profession or historians, how they can avoid the dichotomies that apparently stand in our way of really analyzing the state or deconstructing it in a different way, and what you see in terms of trends in historical research that might help us to get out of this state versus market, or good states or powerful states versus bad states in the future.
Actually, I think legal history and legal theory is absolutely essential to this, and looking, I mean, administrative law isn't the sort of subject that people are totally thrilled about, but I think you have to explore that to try and make sense of this. Actually, I think in relation to the question of federal credit, there's really interesting legal historical work to do. Of course, you're completely right about national differences. And I think many Europeans, although I think particularly Western Europeans, I mean, I'm very struck by how evocative the sort of Reagan-Thatcher rhetoric still is. Certainly in the Czech lands, I mean, and elsewhere. I mean, of course there are huge differences. Of course my school friends in France and England think it's sort of impossibly vulgar that people talk about the state in the way that they do in the United States. But I think there's much more of a sort of consensus about policy possibilities than exists at the level of rhetoric. And I think it's in a way the word is flexibility in a European Union context. And I don't think, I mean, France of course is the nation where really lots of people do work for the state and everybody admires the trains and the museums. But I think the language of flexibility is not one that François Hollande's government is going to particularly avoid. I mean, the huge conceptual, comparative question, of course, is China. And there is a competing ideology of state-led growth, which is very appealing in many countries around the world. But that, I think, is a pretty daunting thought for anyone who's interested in this long and bizarre history from Smith to Gladstone to Marshall and Pigou to even to Buchanan. Because, as I said before, the libertarian critique of the state is a very powerful one that goes to very deep values. So if the sort of two alternatives are China and flexibility come the critique of government spending, and I think it is the Chinese model that's going to matter over the coming generations far more than the French model, then this is, in a way, this makes it even more urgent for the kind of scholars who are involved with INET to sort of pivot a bit and start thinking again about some of these questions which go within our own disciplines as well as out to the world.
Last question.
Yes, I have this. My name is Jan Toporowski from the University of London. One of the reasons why we need a state is because we need an organization to make the payments on the debts of the state. This is obviously the dream of having a minimal state. It involves getting rid of government debt. Isn't the problem in Europe the fact that in Europe there is that minimal state, in the sense that Europe has, the European Commission is down to the 1% of European GDP, but you have a very, very serious government debt problem which needs considerably more than just a minimal state.
Yes, and European governments are having enough difficulty trying to maintain order, or some European governments, without having to think about how to actually raise taxes. I mean, everyone here knows that when Joe Stiglitz was running economic policy, you can get budget surpluses pretty fast. And government debt declines. I mean, it very rarely goes away, but it goes from that sort of frightful moment when it seems unmanageable, as in that awful arrow pointing upwards with Obama hanging on, to the point where it seems manageable and nothing to worry about. And interest rates are very low indeed. So I mean, I'm not, I believe what I read from by my favorite economists about how the public debt problem does go away under appropriate fiscal and economic circumstances. I think the sort of specific issue I mentioned about federal credit guarantees is a very different one, because it's so difficult to predict what's going to happen, and something like Solyndra, of course, had huge political consequences. Will Europe reduce its debt? Of course Europe will get a better debt situation by inflation one of these days. I mean, isn't that likely to happen? But perhaps this is what you've all been talking about all day. But I think from the point of view of relations, not obviously between the market and the state, but between government and another great sort of abstraction, civil society, we really all should be very concerned about what's happening in Athens at the moment, what's happening in Spain at the moment. These are problems of governance, of political economy, and they're ones which have a very, very unpredictable outcome, possibly in the relatively short term. So it's in a way, I've been talking about 200-year problems and 50-year problems of economic theory and public discourse, but I think these issues are very close to the ones which are going to determine what sort of world we live in over the next few years, certainly those of us who more or less live in Europe. So.
So on that note, I'd like to thank Emma for her wonderful discourse that's reminded us that states and markets are not immutable. They need each other. They are essentially social and political constructs, and that they need to be assessed both temporally and spatially. So I think we're off to a very good start for our discussions tomorrow. Thank you all again. I know it's way past bedtime for many of you who've come from overseas. Once again, I'd like to thank our keynote speaker for having given us so much food for thought, and see you all tomorrow bright and early at 9 a.m. Thank you. Professor of History and Director of the Joint Center for History and Economics at Harvard University, Magdalen College, and King's College, Cambridge. In keeping with our objectives, she has really spent her career working at the intersection of economics, history, and philosophy. She has been a member of and one of the things that came up in the plenary previously was, can you think of people who've been sound academics and then worked in the policy dimension as well? Emma Rothschild has been the member of the Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution in the UK and a member of the Council on Science and Technology in the UK. She's a former chair of the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development and is on the board of the United Nations Foundation as well. Her current project with INET is a project that's very much about having economists learn how best to use the tools of history and have historians learn best how to exploit the methodologies and the tools that economics has to offer. And her talk today is going to be on another one of those dichotomies that dogs us, which is states and markets. So welcome, Emma, and thank you.
Thanks very much. So it's great to be here. It's great to be among INET friends, and I knew INET when it was so big, and look at it now. Embedded video should come in. It's very short. Oh no, the other one, the top one. Sorry. What is this? No, the other link, sorry. Why did I put, doesn't matter. What a shame. I think we better, it's the one when he describes what the election is about, and it's about the future of the free enterprise system. Let's go back to, okay. What? It's all right, it's all right. So what do these large disputes over the nature of the system mean? The two large economic ideas, the economic dichotomies on which so much of the election turned, were government and the market, or the state and free enterprise. And the election also turned, even more momentously, on the nature of the system. One of the achievements of the economic policies of 2008 to 9, in the retrospect of their principal figures, the bipartisan policies of President Bush at the end of his term and of President-elect Obama, was to have saved the system. This was the language of then Secretary of the Treasury Paulson, that the policy saved the financial system through the bank bailout, the industrial system through the auto bailout, and the economic
Okay, so if I might now have your attention for the main portion of the program, before we get to the keynote for this evening, I did want to sort of set to rest some very important points about your presence here. One is that no, the barrels here are not full, they're empty. Second, no, CG staff did not drain them. Third, yes, there are tunnels going out of this building because it is a former distillery. And fourth, that's because, as you might imagine, when you have a government intervention like prohibition that is not backed up by sound regulation and institutions, the laws of economics do take over. So that's, in brief, the story of this building. Moving on then, I again wanted to welcome all of you to Waterloo and to CG and to this INET CG conference on false dichotomies, and to say how privileged we are to have in our midst Emma Rothschild to speak to us this evening. There is a biography of her in the program. In many ways she needs no introduction, and rather than repeat it, in terms of the ethos and the objective of this subject that we're treating, let me just say this. Professor Rothschild is the Jeremy and Jane Knowles.
I'd like to start with some recent history, now perhaps almost forgotten. All elections are historic, or at least all national or presidential elections. It's only in retrospect that some come to seem unmomentous. But the US election of 2012 was historic or historical in the very particular sense that the disputes, and there were many, turned to an unusual extent on US economic history, on the history of economic thought, and on the history of economic policy. There was the inheritance of Abraham Lincoln and Theodore Roosevelt, the interpretation of Adam Smith, and even the more recent inheritance of Milton Friedman. All thought is thinking with history. How can one think with the future? But in 2012, the historical has been everywhere. Well, this is a depiction of Governor Romney's major address on economic principles at the University of Chicago. You'll note Milton towards the top, as in Friedman, rather than as in the free enterprise liberalism of Paradise Lost. This is President Obama's major address in Kansas, also on economic principles. And this, before the candidate for whom I guess some 59 million Americans voted only a few days ago is entirely forgotten, is what it was all about. And this is where my economic or free enterprise system by averting a catastrophic crisis. Well, the election results suggest that this retrospective argument was, by a narrow margin, convincing. But is it really the case that there are historic changes underway in the character of the economic system, or in the relationship between the market and the state? Well, the most straightforward economic statistics present a puzzle. This is overall government expenditure and federal government expenditure as a share of gross domestic product in the United States over the period from 1970 to 2011, a very undramatic picture. And these are personal income and personal taxes over the same period. A dramatic picture in this case, but one that is very different from the picture of an ever-encroaching state, in that personal taxes have declined very substantially as a share of personal income, just as government expenditure has been more or less stable as a percentage of GDP. So how are these pictures to be reconciled? One possibility is that something historic may have been happening, that the impact or importance of government has increased more than its size, that the effectiveness or perhaps the insidiousness of government has increased over time. A possible explanation may have to do with the size of the national debt.